Continuing on our study of Book of Hebrew. Book of Hebrew was written to believers who were living in the time of hardship, persecution under the Roman Empire. That despite whatever the believers were experiencing, hardship and difficulty, if we lift up our eyes and focus on Jesus Christ, then heaven's grace and mercy and strength will be given so that we can overcome with faith. Last Sunday, we saw how Abraham became father of all believing. In the important questions about life in different situations, when, how, why, who, where. So many different questions that could arise at important juncture. He didn't know all the answers, but he knew what God has spoken. Without knowing all the answers, he obeyed. And he became father of all who believe. And then other saints, always seeking eternal home. Not earthly home to go back, but eternal home that God is preparing. And always waiting for heaven and longing for heaven. That did not make them impractical. Actually, that caused these believers to be most practical. Or even going beyond being practical. Overcoming what is even practicality. They became the salt and light of the world. They became people that the world desperately needs. The world cannot do without. So we are examining the walk of faith of saints who have become the light and salt of the earth. First, Abraham. It says verse 17. It begins with Abraham when he was tested. This shows how God puts his people through testing of faith. It wasn't just Abraham, but all the saints who have gone before us. They were tested in their faith, and they have passed. We will also be required to go through testing of our faith, so that our faith can be shown to be genuine. That we can truly be the fruits, not just the chaff. Testing of faith that shows that we are real, that our faith is genuine. Even this prolonged COVID pandemic is a time where our faith is being tested, proved. Through the difficulties and hardship, God is shaking all of us. Wake up from your slumber. God is, through difficulty and hardship, trials, God is waking our spirit to examine, to see whether our faith is real, whether our faith is living faith. Confirming, testing, proving. For Abraham, God asking him to sacrifice his son Isaac was probably the most difficult test he ever faced in his life. He waited for the fulfillment of God's promise for son over 25 years. And finally, when he was 100 years old, his wife Sarah being 90, Isaac was born. Son of a promise, this Isaac. And now he is 12, 13 years old. And God is asking him, offer your one and only son. As far as God was concerned, the fulfillment of God's promises for children and descendants was to be fulfilled through Isaac. So Ishmael didn't count. God says, your one and only son, the son you love. Why? I thought God gave Isaac as fulfillment of his promise for a son. Waited for 25 years. He's already 100 years old. 110. If Isaac is 12, he's 112. He didn't know why, but he obeys. Verse 17, he who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, who was to be the vehicle, the channel through which God's promise of this descendants was to be fulfilled. Verse 18, even though God has said to him, it is through Isaac, the son, that I am asking you to sacrifice. Through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. If God's promise of numerous descendants is to be fulfilled, then this son needs to survive. Why is God asking sacrifice of his son? There could be question, conflict. This doesn't make sense. But when we read Genesis chapter 22, he does not hesitate to obey. He received this word the next day, early in the morning. He packs the donkey saddled with wood for the burnt offering. Takes his son, couple of servants, follow the master in this long journey. For 3-day journey to Mount Moriah, Abraham wasn't shaken in his resolve to obey. It wasn't at the spur of the moment, attending some kind of like evening revival and in the atmosphere of the emotion, heightened emotion. Somehow he makes a commitment, and the next day and the day after he begins to regret. That wasn't the case. If this was a spur of the moment, heat of the moment, just emotional response, during 3-day journey, he could say, I have come to senses, let's go back. I want to set aside for a week and pray and receive God's clear confirmation that this is what he really wants. No. He doesn't have that kind of second guessing of what God has spoken. He's going toward Mount Moriah to sacrifice his own son. If I sacrifice him, what happens to God's promise for descendants? Isn't this contradiction? Isn't this a problem? He's not wrestling with this seeming contradiction. The only way to understand this is like he gave this problem as, it's not my problem, it's God's problem. My role, my duty is to obey him. God will have to sort it out. God will have to take care of the rest. Trust and obey, and he will take care of the rest. I am to obey. I am to trust and obey. He will take care of the rest. That's the only way to understand how Abraham was able to obey without wavering, without second guessing. He didn't take this as his problem. He said, I'm just going to obey God. God who gave me this son when I was 100 years old. That same God who was faithful, he's asking me to sacrifice this son. I will do it. Whatever he says, I will do it. Ball is in his court. He will take care of the rest. Brothers and sisters, would you repeat after me? Trust and obey. God will take care of the rest. That's what he thought. I'm not going to hold on to this ball or this hot potato. God, it's your problem. I'll just obey and follow. You take care of the rest. Wow. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. God said the promise of children and descendants will be fulfilled through this child. If that's the case, even if I offer him as a sacrifice, God will raise him from the dead. That's why when we read Genesis chapter 22, when he arrives at the foot of the mountain, he leaves the donkey and the servants. Lads, you stay here with this animal. I and my son will go and worship God, and we will return. Now, was Abraham deceiving his servants and lying? If they find out that the master was about to slaughter and sacrifice his one and only son that was born and he was one of you, will these servants say, he's going out of his mind, we have to protect the son? Will they intervene? Is he lying? If he is going up to worship God, he isn't about to lie with his lips. He believed in his heart, without a shred of doubt, that he will go and worship God, offering his son as a sacrifice, but God will raise him from the dead, so that he knew we are coming back together. Wow. So when he went up a mountain, built an altar, laid the wood, and he bound his own son. It doesn't say anything about this 12, 13-year-old son resisting his elderly father. And when Abraham raised the dagger, in his heart, he already sacrificed his son and offered to God. Even if he didn't actually strike him in his heart, he already offered his son to God. An angel of the Lord appeared. Abraham, Abraham, do not lay your hands on your son. Don't touch him. You did not withhold your own son, your one and only son. And now it is known that you fear God. Verse 19, and figuratively speaking, the Greek word is in parabole. In parable. Like Jesus speaks in parables. This was like parable. What parable? One and only Son of God being sacrificed for our sins and being raised to life in resurrection. That's the parable. Figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. This became prophetic parable of God's one and only Son being offered as a sacrifice and rising to life. And that's why in early church fathers like Irenaeus says, when Isaac was carrying the wood on his back up the Mount Moriah, that's parable picture of Jesus carrying the cross to Mount Calvary. For Abraham, he didn't know why that God would ask the sacrifice of his son. But he knew God's promise of numerous children will be fulfilled through him. He knew God's promise will be fulfilled in his own family. So without knowing the reason, he obeys and says, I will obey. God will take care of the rest. Wow. And then Isaac. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. We know the story. Isaac loved older son Esau, macho, hunter. Mom, Rebecca, she loved younger son Jacob, always around the house, mama's boy. So mom, Rebecca, and son Jacob, younger son, they conspire to deceive father Isaac so that he received the blessing of the firstborn. After that ceremony, blessing was done, maybe within an hour, Esau came back from hunting, prepared a meal, and went into his father. Father, I brought the delicacies that you want. Bless me. Oh, who was the one who received the prayer, a blessing? You know the story. But you know what's surprising? When Isaac discovered that this pronouncement of a prayer blessing for the firstborn was given to Jacob in deception. He didn't say, what is done in deception is null. He didn't want to revoke or nullify. He was shaking and he says, this is the will of God. This is the sovereignty of God unfolding. Why? Before these children were born, there was already a prophecy. God had chosen the younger. The older will serve the younger. Even though he, as a father, he liked older son, Esau, and wanted to give the blessing of firstborn to Esau. As the way it unfolds, God has made in such a way that younger son, Jacob, has received already the prayer blessing for the firstborn. This is the way God's will is done. He was shaking, but immediately he submits to God's will. Not my will, not my preference, but God's will. Immediate submission. And Hebrews chapter 11 says, that's Isaac's faith being demonstrated. Not insisting my way, but immediately submission to God's sovereign will. And then next person, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying. Do you remember in chapter 11 verse 13 says, all these people are still living by faith when they died. There are saints who have gone before us who lived all their life in faith, and in the moment of death, they still had maintained their faith. They didn't waver. Their faith wasn't weakened or shaken. Even though nothing has become a reality in front of their lives, they were able to see through the lens of faith that God's promise will be fulfilled in the future. So they died, seeing it from far distance, but welcoming it in joy. And they were dying in faith, and they passed on this legacy of faith upon their children and grandchildren. That's Jacob. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying. You know, in Jacob's life, there are many incidences where his faith was demonstrated. Probably most famous was when he was wrestling with God, God's angel. Bless me, I can't let you go. Wham! And his hip was came out of socket. And yet he didn't let go. He was like, bless me. Without God's blessing, I can't live. His name was changed. His destiny was changed. But here in chapter 11 of Hebrew, the incident that is being focused as an expression of his demonstration, his faith, is when he blessed Joseph's sons. Now we know from reading in Genesis, he not only blessed Joseph's children, but he blessed all 12 sons, all 12 tribes received blessing. But why only Joseph's sons being blessed, being highlighted here? Think about Joseph's sons. When these children were born, Joseph was the prime minister of Egypt, second to only Pharaoh. When Pharaoh appointed Joseph as, you are only second in this kingdom, only me, and then all of Egypt will listen to you, the highest, most powerful person. And then, Joseph was still single. So Pharaoh gave him a bride. Genesis chapter 41 verse 45 says, Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On. In ancient Egypt, priests were aristocrats, the highest social class. After king's own royalty family, it was priests. They were never taxed. All other king's royal court officers and everybody paid tax, tribute to Pharaoh. Priest didn't. Most prestigious family. So here, Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's two sons, they were born in nobility, in the most powerful family in the nation. Behind Pharaoh's family It's Joseph, the prime minister. Not only most powerful, most prestigious, probably wealthiest. So these children, they've never been to Palestine. They don't know how their cousins lived as the nomads, tending the flock. They were born in like a palace in capital city. Probably behind the royal palace, Joseph's house was probably the largest. These children were born with not only silver spoon, probably diamond spoon in their mouth. All their life they were treated like princes. But here is grandpa about to die, and he declares a blessing. And he says, God, may Manasseh and Ephraim become successful just like their dad, Joseph, with power and authority, and be a channel of God's blessing in this nation. That's not what he says. He says, may they be called by the names of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Who are they? Nobody. Nomads. Tending the sheep flock. For Egyptians, they are abominations. Oh, they're dirty people. You don't want to go near these smelly people. But grandpa says, may you be called by the name of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God's chosen people. The people who have received God's covenant and promise. Meaning, may you inherit the faith of God's covenant. Even if you become nomads, moving tents from one location to another, even though there is no earthly palace for you to settle in, may you serve God of Abraham, God of Jacob, and God of Isaac. That's what grandpa's declaring. Your father, Joseph, is the prime minister of Egypt. He is the most powerful person, but this isn't a place where you need to settle and seek earthly success. No. May you live as people of God's covenant, going back to God's promised land. And in your lives, may God's promises be fulfilled so that you declare God's glory to the ends of the earth. And then Jacob's son Joseph, what did he say? By faith, when his end was near, he also lived in faith and died in faith. When his end was near, spoke about the Exodus. You know, we know many examples of Joseph's faith. When he was sold as a slave for 10 years in General Potiphar's house, he was faithful. And when Potiphar's wife enticed him, he said, how can I do such an evil thing in the eyes of God? No, I will walk by faith. He was falsely accused, thrown in jail for 3 years, rotting in jail. He wasn't bitter. Why? Because he was walking with God. Always in the face of God. Koram deo, in the face of God. We thought that was an example of his faith. But here it says, the most clear example of his faith is speaking about Exodus and ordering about his own bones also being going through Exodus process so that to be buried in God's promised land. Not in the pyramids of Egypt. When you people leave, make sure you take my bones and bury me. Even if it's a small cave, may I be buried. May my bones be buried in the promised land. You know, until his death, he was the most powerful prime minister of Egypt. Not only most powerful, but during the 7-year famine, because he was in charge of distribution of the grains. All the Egyptians brought all their money, all their land. They said, buy us as a slave and give us food. So all of Egypt become Pharaoh's slave because of Joseph's control. Neighboring land and neighboring people brought their treasure to buy grain. Probably amassed huge wealth. He could make provision so that his children and grandchildren will become the most powerful officers in the kingdom for decades to come. But that's not what he does. He says, time will come that God's promise will be fulfilled. You people all will leave Exodus. Not a single person is to stay behind. All leave. Go back to the land of promise. And take my bones with you when you leave. This isn't my home. Probably during his tenure as a prime minister, they already made small pyramid, the burial chamber for this. And probably he allowed him to be buried for his children and descendants. But he says, Exodus, take my bones. And by declaring that, he says, I am waiting for eternal home. This isn't my home. I'm waiting for God's home. And because of that, God's trusting in God's faithfulness, God's promise coming true. Actually, that was the faith when he was falsely accused and thrown in prison for 3 years, or living as slave for 10 years. That's the same faith that sustained him. Always trusting in God's promises, God's faithfulness. Whether prime minister or slave or prisoner, always looking for fulfillment of God's promise. Let me wrap up. Abraham didn't know why, but he obeyed, knowing God's promise will be fulfilled in his family. Trust and obey. God will take care of the rest. It's not my problem. My call, my duty is to obey. God will take care of the rest. And Isaac, letting go of his preference, his will, and submission to God's will. Oh, this is the way God is letting it unfold. And Jacob, to grandchildren, may you live as God's people. Not wealthy, powerful family here, success. No, not earthly success. Serve God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob. Serve God who blesses the pilgrims. And Joseph, even though I was prime minister, this is not it. I have eternal home. I am waiting. I'm a pilgrim. All of you are pilgrims. You will have an exodus. Take my bones with you. God's promises will come true. May we follow the footsteps of these pilgrims. Join me in a prayer. In your own words, would you tell God, God, I want to trust and obey that you will take care of the rest. Not insisting my way, my will, but immediate submission to God's will and God's sovereignty. Not earthly success, but living as pilgrims waiting for eternal home. Trusting in God who will fulfill the promise always in your own